My name is Eric Lombardi, and I'm exploring a run for Ontario Liberal leader.
And why should people care about the Ontario Liberal leadership race?
Because the Ontario Liberal Party is going to form the next government in Ontario. So you should care because if you join the leadership race, you might be voting for the next premier.
And is that what makes you care?
Well, what I care about is that, and I don't like to dwell in negativity, but Ontario has real challenges. Our province has been in decline, and in many ways, it's a shame because Ontario has so much potential. And so if the Ontario Liberal Party doesn't deliver the debate Ontarians deserve and offer a real path forward next election, how are we going to, A, regain people's trust, but B, put our province on a trajectory that it should have been on in the first place?
In having that debate, what are sort of some of the main talking points you feel like has been missing from the Liberal leadership?
Well, number one, we have to focus on our economy, right? Especially for young people, our underperformance and lack of competitiveness has meant that we have the highest youth unemployment rate in the country and since the 1980s. We have seen a stagnation in people's wages for 25 years. Places like Oshawa and Windsor have lower incomes adjusted for inflation today than they did at the turn of the century. That's a shame. And so since we've left so much growth on the table, our politicians have gotten into the habit of managing decline rather than fixing some of the fundamental problems about why we've become undercompetitive. And so if the Ontario Liberal Party doesn't have a salient message on economic growth and prosperity, I think people are going to find it hard to see the province and party as credible going forward.
And that's why you're on the campaign trail. And I'd love to actually get, more on your experience on that. How's your life changed since you started campaigning?
Well, I mean, in many ways, like what's been interesting is being able to go around the province and talk to people and realize that, differences aren't all that much between places, right? Like when I've been doing a lot of stops in rural Ontario. So I was in Kincardine and Woodstock, and both of them had a similar response. Like, we've lost good bus and regional transportation services after Greyhound collapsed. And it was like, of course people want these kind of services in place, and they should be there, right? So you go back to the GTA, and people are also really concerned about getting around and the lack of quality transportation, especially between regional centers. And it's like, these are solvable problems. And I think sometimes we don't recognize how solvable the problems that we have are. So that's been really illuminating as a part of this. And otherwise, the main way my life has changed is I'm learning how to be a politician, because I come into this more as an advocate in housing or, a finance guy. I'm not polished in the same way that potentially some other candidates might be. But in the same vein, I think I'm probably more authentic because I'm willing to tell you what I think.
Mm-hmm. What has sort of clashed most with your personality? Because these are very different sectors.
I think what's clashed most with my personality, and I actually think that this is something that I just need to work on, is I care about the details a lot. But sometimes you don't need to talk at the detail level. You need to talk at the why and being able to articulate that clearly. So, people ask me, who do you take inspiration from in politics? Mm-hmm. And if I can deliver anything, I would say, Bill Clinton, explainer-in-chief, was able to take harder issues and really make them real for people in a way that helped them understand. If I can channel that and learn how to do that, it'll not just be good for my own life outside of politics, but hopefully it'll make me more successful in politics as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to take a little bit of a roundabout way moving forward to talk a little bit more about you. So, and you do talk a lot about young people. Let's go back to when you were a bit younger. When you were 14, what was the most important thing in your life?
At 14, the most important thing in my life was getting my education and going to school and spending time with friends. What I was always interested in was science and math and physics, and that's actually why I went to the University of Waterloo, where I studied nanotechnology engineering, because I really wanted to build the coolest things with the most advanced knowledge.
What are some of those things that, when you were applying to nanotech and you were thinking at 18 years old, what were you sort of thinking about the future of what was possible?
Well, some of the things that I thought were really interesting were like, the semiconductor industry, which is just the underlying driver of computational progress, and the challenge and interest in the physics behind it I always found really compelling. We were showing some major leadership, and we continue to be, especially in the Waterloo region, on both theoretical physics with the Perimeter Institute, but also the establishment of the Institute for Quantum Computing. Now, what I found really interesting in like quantum information and quantum computing is what's called nonlinearity in computational power. And so quantum computers are going to be able to offer us the ability to solve problems that are simply impossible, even with the most powerful supercomputers that we have, because they don't operate like a traditional computer does. And so I found all these trends extremely fascinating. I also saw interest in things like photonics and sensors and material science. There's so much opportunity for progress, especially right now, where even our just tools for discovery are becoming even better with things like AI.
Totally. So I have, there's sort of two branches that stick out to me from that sort of conversation. Let's start with the first one. So we all know that, our political leaders might not have the most technical expertise, especially for different private industries. You seem to be someone who's bringing a lot of technical expertise to the table. What advantage do you think that brings having a political leader actually have like technical science expertise that currently doesn't seem to be the case with any of the leadership?
Yeah, and what I'd actually add on to is that I've been building my career in both technology, but specifically within financial services. And so I've been working in the private sector doing major mergers and acquisitions and strategy work for major financial institutions. And so I bring both technical, scientific, and financial experience to this race in a way that I don't think many other campaigns can offer. And what that means for Ontario is that not only do I profess to care about the industries that are going to drive the 21st century economy, I actually understand the science and engineering behind them. And in many ways, right, if you look at what's happening in things like AI, what I see as a huge opportunity for Ontario is that we are the only jurisdiction that pairs several really key advantages to winning the future. Number one, I think autonomous machines are going to become far more common in our day-to-day lives. But we are the only jurisdiction I can think of that has major financial and capital resources in a big city like Toronto, heart and financial center of the country. We have the mechanical engineering supply chain in our automotive sector. And then we have the talent production in AI and mechanical engineering to drive the future here. And we probably have the most competitive electricity system in North America if we really want it. And if you look at a place like New York or even California, they can't offer all those same things. These industries are not based in the same place. So from all the way from the resources, like lithium, cobalt, iron, etc., that we have in our north, to manufacturing, mechanical engineering supply chains, to capital, to talent, to energy, Ontario is uniquely positioned in the world to be a huge winner in these industries, but only if we get it right.
And I feel like I've been hearing that, my whole life. I feel like, everyone kind of says that opportunity and abundance are, right next door for Ontario, but that seemingly hasn't happened yet. Yeah. So what are the major barriers in actually achieving these things that we've heard about for so long?
Well, we have a funny way of getting in our own way. So when you look at our regulatory and permitting systems, they are very complex, and they don't really need to be so, right? I'll give you an example. In Ottawa, I know someone who was trying to install grid-scale energy storage, which supports the development of renewables. And the permitting process for that goes through the municipal planning processes. And so what you had was a lot of local neighbors, communities saying that this might catch on fire, it might, things that for which, a lightning strike hitting them is more likely. inserting themselves into the process. And so for things like that, I would actually like to see us say, do you know what? This is provincial infrastructure that we need to enable with simpler systems. We should be doing the permitting for these kind of things at the provincial level. And so it's going to require for us to get out of our own way to enable some of these things to get forward. And I think that's number one. Number two, governments have a way of pursuing trying to choose winners and losers and who is going to build out certain things in the province. But what you see in industrial policy elsewhere is they focus on like neutral policy that have companies and businesses focus on using that subsidy to create what is called capital. And capital often sounds like money to people, but in economic terms, it means machinery, right? It means new tools. And these are things that end up bringing down the cost of producing a certain good, right? It brings down the cost of a single unit. And that's how you make production in the province competitive, not just for here, but globally. And so we've gotten a lot of these things wrong over the last 20 years. And I think it's going to take a really critical lens to understand the purpose of these systems and to invest in them properly so we really create the opportunity to attract competition and private capital to really drive out the growth of the industries.
So if I'm understanding what you said correctly, it is both capacity and process that we need to update to make these changes in Ontario. Capacity being the actual sort of resources we have in manufacturing, the actual sort of factories, technology we have, and then process, getting rid of the rules that don't make sense. Now, a criticism or a question that might come up when thinking about sort of deregulating this way is there may be the argument for removing a rule, or a rule might be argued to be inefficient, but it actually provides a value in security. And how would you navigate sort of getting rid of the rules that seem redundant, but keeping the rules that actually make sure things are safe, make sure things are caring about environmental protections, things like that?
You know, there are always trade-offs, right? And I think what's important to know is to be conscientious that trade-offs exist and that adding complexity, because it feels good, doesn't always lead to the outcomes that people desire. So we do have to make sure that we have a critical lens. Like, are our systems delivering the outcomes that we expect of them? And if not, then we're going to need to change them. And then for each rule or regulation that we have, we need to do a value judgment. Is the cost of continuing to follow or do this thing worth the impacts to the outcomes that we're driving? And I think what we have failed to recognize, not just as a society, but as progressives, is that as we add rules and complexity, it doesn't necessarily create better things for people. So regulations aren't a hug. They serve a purpose. And I think what people need to really understand is that the addition of all these things, it's actually affected the public sector's ability to deliver for us more than it even has the private sector in many ways. And so we need to focus on the outcomes, and our systems and processes need to be based in the rule of law. The role of discretion and access to politicians should not matter very much. That's how you get corruption, that's how you get rent seeking, that's how you get cottage industries form. And that the rules that exist drive the kind of investment that we want to see, because we know in the long term that will raise our living standards. And then the role isn't to solve every trade-off, but it's to acknowledge that they exist and to figure out what ways we can manage them. And so that's how I would approach policymaking, and for people who are concerned, right? Sometimes a rule that protects the environment is worth the trade-off, but also sometimes it's not. And we need to be reasonable and to be able to have these nuanced conversations in a way that allows us to have systems that result in outcomes that people ultimately want.
In politics, like, you are going to let some people down.
Yeah.
How do you do that in a way that's, not disparaging to the things that they care about or they believe?
You tell them the truth, right? And I think politicians have a unique and special way of dancing around conflict. And I actually think if you just tell them, look, I understand your concern, but I don't think that the remedy is worth the trade-off to the outcome for people at large. And I think we see a lot of this stuff. My background is in housing, More Neighbours Toronto, which is one of the organizations that I started, it rose really to combat the fact that whenever new housing and developments and proposals were coming forward in Toronto, you'd have like an army of NIMBYs that would show up and say, I have concerns. And then we spend oftentimes years litigating those concerns. But the outcome for our generation has been, well, big picture, no one can afford to live on the ground anymore, anywhere near Toronto. And number two, no one can afford enough space to start families. So were all these objections that were raised by a relatively small group of people worthwhile to screw up a process that needed to be more effective to build better quality housing at lower prices? I don't think we made that trade-off effectively. I doubt many in our generation would. Mm-hmm. And so that's like a real-life consequence when we decide that we're not going to spend political capital on guiding people to why we believe certain things. Mm-hmm. I'll paint one more example here. Just down the street, we have the Corktown Station development. Well, they're going to name it Distillery District for the Ontario line. And we spent the last 2 years doing an archaeological study on the site because it was the first Parliament site in Canada. I'm not exactly sure what they found, but we probably spent $50 million or more as a part of this. And I get some of the reasons, right? There might be important Indigenous history there, etc. But the context of this site was, for decades, it was a budget rental truck parking lot. And then before that, it was a natural gas utility. And then before that, it was a jail. And now we decide that this is a valuable part of the process that's worth spending, $50 to $100 million doing, and all the time and costs that drives for project outcomes. Well, then we end up in a situation where the average cost per kilometre of building the Ontario line is $1.1 billion. And we see in Paris, they're building fully underground, fully automated metros for $250 million per kilometre, 1/4 of the cost we're doing it. So when we look at our systems, are we really making the trade-offs of time, effort to ultimate value for society? I don't think we made that right trade-off in that case. And so I think it's important that our politicians understand these systems and are willing to say, the trade-offs aren't worth it here. And I understand the reasons why people want things. But you have to take defense and you have to be willing to stand for things. And so for me, I do believe that the public will respect that when we're honest about the trade-offs that we're making and why.
On Twitter, you said, the messaging from municipal, provincial, and federal governments in Toronto is quite clear. They simply do not care that Canada's middle class is dying off with the boomers. Canada will have an upper class, 20%, an elite class, 2%, and a servant class that will wait decades for affordability. What is the biggest thing that contributes to that? And what is the most important thing that you think that the Liberals would do to change that trajectory?
So it's housing, right? It has become an inheritance economy when people know, regardless of whether they're working hard or not, it is so hard to afford entry in Ontario that you have to have help oftentimes from parents, not just for down payments, but to even co-sign mortgages. And so what that means is that in the future, we might see professional couples able to still achieve that dream. But where we are now is that the middle class can't. And so we'll see perpetual rental. There will be, wait lists for public housing, right? And there's a lot of good feelings around these things, but I think when we've undermined the ability of our market to be able to deliver broad-based, middle-class, abundant housing, we diminish the value of work and become, in many ways, a feudalistic society. And we already see that in Toronto, where we actually see a level of out-migration of people under the age of 35, and particularly of kids under 5. This is no longer a place for families. This is a place for the economic elite, and we're seeing it's becoming a place for professionals. And then oftentimes there's a huge gap between those groups and the services class that supports them. But even that services class is not being afforded the quality of life a lot of hardworking jobs in the past did here. And that breaks something. in our society. And I think it's one of the reasons why we're seeing a decline in social trust to begin with. And so I think if there's just one trend that we need to fight, because it's critical to the long term for our civilization to be rooted in these liberal values, we have to return housing prices to sanity for normal people.
The outcome that you describe of the outmigration and the type of people that can only afford to live in Toronto, you view that as a loss.
Yes.
Sometimes. What is being lost? Why is that?
Well, you look at, for instance, right, we have a lot of nursing shortages in our hospitals, right? But a nurse isn't just a nurse. A nurse is a person who wants to build their life, have dreams, have a family. Well, if you're earning $80,000 a year in Toronto and you go and meet someone who might be a social worker or a teacher, and you still can't afford to have enough space to raise your kids, well, at some point, where you want to live and the profession you want to work in isn't viable here. But then, do we not want nurses and teachers to live in Toronto? Like, of course we do. Like, it'd be crazy to say otherwise. And so we have this problem, and the only intractable way to solve it is to fix underlying root cause, and that's to fix housing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you do write a lot about young people and the struggles of stagnation economically. Is there a moment that stands out to you where you really felt it was incredibly palpable, or like you felt it wasn't just a unique thing you were experiencing, but you're seeing it really society-wide?
Well, the way I came into caring about housing, or like interested in housing economics, was I went to go do my first co-op in California. I was moving from Waterloo to Palo Alto. And I was so excited because I thought I got this great job. And I went from paying like $400 a month in rent in Waterloo, and it's far more for students today, to Palo Alto, and I couldn't find anything that was not a dump for like under $2,500. So I was like, what broke here? And then I started learning about it, and I was like, oh my God, like, this is like Toronto 101, like, what's gonna happen here? And then we saw the explosion of prices that kind of happened starting after 2014, 2015. And so when I moved back, I was like seeing so many of my friends and even myself feel like trapped at a stage of life, even though many of us were earning decent incomes, not able to progress to the next milestones. And I've even seen it in my peer group, like the number of people who've, they've got partners or they've even gotten married, but they like haven't been able to afford enough space to have kids. And how socially corrosive all of these things are over the long term. And so that really got me inspired to get involved, because I was like, who is fighting against these trends? There is one more point here, is I believe that liberalism only works when people believe that their work can translate into real ownership stake in their own future. And so I think sometimes there's a lot of almost like arrogance in liberal thinking that, we're good, affluent people, and all we need to do is like help the poor. But we often forget that there's a lot of people who are aspiring to build their own lives, and they want things like to live the dream of home ownership. And it's not just about it being an investment to them, right? It's an important milestone in their own self-identity. We've forgotten how important that these things are to people's happiness in a functioning society. And so for me, it's important to talk about these issues bluntly, because so many people in our political classes just have platitudes. And I think that's a shame.
It's an incredible shame, because this actually touches on something that you just said of, it makes you look at other societies and question, what is the value that I'm getting being a citizen here? What is the social contract that I am engaging in, that I am expected to be a part of? And there's a resentment that can very quietly build up of, what am I doing? What is going on? And it sounds like you've seen that firsthand, and like, yeah, could you touch more on like how that feels?
Well, look at the collapse in self-reported happiness in Canada. It's almost entirely driven by young people under the age of 30. And we've really struggled to have this conversation properly. But I'll say it, like the last 30 years of public policy trade-offs have fallen particularly hard on young people. And so, you work hard, you have to get more credentials than you used to, and then you enter a job market that has less stability than it did in the past, and it takes longer to build savings, etc., to achieve the same things in the past. Meanwhile, we pay a lot of taxes, And a lot of taxes go to, for instance, like older Canadians, and many of them have worked hard. But you look at systems like federally, OAS, and if you're a retired couple earning $180,000, you're still getting a $20,000 benefit from the federal government before it starts phasing out. If you're a family with kids, that phase out starts at $60,000. And so it's hard not to look at so many of these systems and we fail to acknowledge the truth. A lot of it is not stacked in favor of the next generation. We're the ones who are left with the bill. And so if we can't have these conversations with nuance, I don't think we overcome the barriers that are holding our society and our economy back.
I think the nice thing that I see with, as I get more engaged and as I meet more people, is something that you just said of there, and this is just the way politics has always been, this desire and this dance around the truth and this lack of being blunt and giving the answer that you want to hear rather than the question that was actually asked. I do feel like there's a level of honesty that our generation brings to the table that I do really admire.
Yeah, and I think that's important. And I think when people are looking to political leaders, there's 16 million people in this province. There aren't 16 million parties. So people aren't looking for leadership that is, I am a liberal and I only do liberal things. They want to look for people that they can trust. And so people, I believe, in this province are, A, ready to reward bravery, but B, they're looking to see that someone thinks through the problems that we have. They don't need to agree on every outcome, but they should agree that and hope that the values are largely aligned and that they can trust as a result, because that leader is willing to say, I'm willing to tell you the truth, and here's exactly what I think. And I think for too long, especially for liberals, we've managed our comms too tightly. We've tried to slice and dice the rhetoric with different rhetoric that appeals to stakeholder groups. But voters aren't stakeholders. They're more than the sum of their parts. And I think it's important that liberals remember that we should see people as individuals who are unique and that we want to empower to live their best lives the way that they think they should be lived.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. And actually, who I would love to see this podcast would be somebody who hears what you say about the problems currently in Ontario and has this feeling of this is just another politician saying the same stuff that everyone else said. And I want them to have a feeling of why change might be different moving forward.
Yeah.
What would your, again, you already touched on it a bit of why these things currently exist. What excites you about how they can change moving forward? What excites you about the sort of energy you've seen out as you've been campaigning?
Well, I think this is especially true for younger people. We want to live in a society that is developed and advanced. Like, we want to be proud of the infrastructure and services that we have here in Ontario. Look at the response to Pierre Poilievre saying he doesn't want the high-speed rail line. And, people are angry about it because, do you know what? I actually don't want Canada to be 100 years behind other developed countries when it comes to what is probably one of the world's most logical cores for this kind of infrastructure. So I think that we sometimes forget, and we've forgotten this since the Cold War, that liberal democracy isn't the end of history. And if we cannot prove that liberal democracy can still deliver meaningful progress and material well-being in people's lives, well then they're going to start looking to other systems and look at Chinese technological socialism. I don't personally want to live under a dictatorship, but in many ways they're demonstrating that they can build great infrastructure and raise material living standards for people over time. So are we going to understand that we are in competition with that, and if we cannot deliver the things that we promise at reasonable costs, reasonable budgets, and reasonable time, especially when we commit to them, people are going to continue to lose faith in this system. And then the shining beacon of enlightenment could be lost. And so underlying all of my motivations is this belief that we need to fight our decline and remember what true liberal values, not the big L ones, but the small L ones that have defined the Canadian identity are, and base our systems and values in those. And then the shining beacon of enlightenment could be lost. And so underlying all of my motivations is this belief that we need to fight our decline and remember what true liberal values, not the big L ones, but the small L ones that have defined the Canadian identity are, and base our systems and values in those.
Yeah, totally. It's like that Steve Jobs had a speech or a video out there where he's like, the world changes when you realize that all the rules that were made by people not that much smarter than you.
Yeah.
And half of them don't really exist.
Yes.
Yeah.
People say, like, why didn't you run as an MPP first? Well, like, is there a rule for that? No, of course. So will I run as an MPP in the next election, almost regardless of outcome? Of course. But I want to make sure that my message gets out there. I do think that Ontarians have been deprived about a proper debate for its future. I think that there has not been any political leaders, as long as I've been alive, that have really stood up for the interests of our generation and the one that's following. And if that voice doesn't come into our politics, well, then these issues aren't going to get prioritized. And so for me, it's not just about the path to winning. It's a path to influencing. And to me, that's as just a noble a goal as winning.
Let's say influence is what happens. What would the influence that you hope to leave on the Ontario political scene?
It's not going to just be in one area, right? Because I care about a lot of things. But I hope that regardless of outcome, these ideas get picked up and they get brought into the party's platform. But importantly, if the Ontario Liberals are on the rise, that creates competition in politics. And so sometimes even just having the ideas on the radar and adopted even by an opposition party can find their way into being legislative because the governing party sees a threat in someone else bringing forward an idea that might swing votes. And that, to me, is how we change the trajectory of our politics. And so would I prefer to do that as the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party? Of course. But there's more than one way to win. And that's a great outcome for me as well.
Yeah, totally. Last thing, if you want to just take a look at the camera and say exactly who you are and why you're running.
Well, my name is Eric Lombardi. I'm exploring a run for the Ontario Liberal Party leadership. And I think if you're a young person, you have a great future in this province. Ontario has every potential in the world. We have land, we have resources, we have industry, we have talent, we have good-hearted people, we have a great climate that is going to only pay us even more dividends into the future. This is a place where you can invest in the future. Our challenges are not impossible to overcome. Don't give in to cynicism. We can build a great future together.
Perfect.